Welcome back. Today we are going to take a look at Kinera Celest. So Celest, of course, is their first set with the square planar driver. And working with that square planar driver is a balanced armature, which is actually in the nozzle right there. Can't quite see it through the grill, but it is there right behind it. So this one is the black color with the design on it. There's a plain version that has no design on it, but I kind of like the design. I think it actually came out quite well, probably a little better in person than it does on the pictures, and it does say Celest on the side, 2-pin, and so quite nice shell. I think everyone has seen many pictures of that one. This is the cable, so nice black and silver 4-core cable, which is actually quite nice. Get the Celest logo on it again, quite nice. This is the packaging, which is kind of nice for $49 as well. So when we kind of get into Celest, what does it actually sound like? Kind of the first thing, I believe it reminded me of a couple different sets that, recent sets, that are all kind of bassy, warmish, fun, non-fatiguing. KB Ears Robin was one of them, and that's a nice hybrid set. Not so technical, it's just kind of a bassy, warm, very relaxed, kind of not so much in the upper treble kind of set. And then Topaz is very similar. Again, you get this nice bass curve, runs a little bit into your mids to give it a little natural warmth, relaxed rise, dips pretty hard, and then it kind of rolls off a little early. So seeing that Celest has a very similar curve to those two, it actually does resemble those two in sound signature. Celest has this kind of bassier low end, a little, it's a little thicker, maybe a little more dynamic driver sounding bass than the other group of full range planars. So this is kind of a little bit thicker. Again, it runs kind of right into your mids, and it gives you kind of a more natural, weightier, bodier, low end vocals. Quite nice, very likable. A nice easy rise into pin again, and then it rolls off more like Topaz. And this roll off is kind of hard and kind of deep. And those of you who are really keyed into instruments hitting a little harder at 5K will find this one hitting, quite a bit softer. And then the roll off here, for those of you who are into lots of air and sparkle, not as much on Celest. So if you're curious how that sort of lines up to a set like Alina, which is a little bit more expensive, maybe about twice as expensive as Celest, kind of a similar bass curve. Of course, Alina is a dynamic driver, so this is sort of very similar, but same idea, just enough warmth right into your mids, give it enough note weight, very nice mids, easier rise into the pin again, and then Alina sort of carries over extensions, so from 2 to 5, and then arc over in sort of a Harmon style without really dropping off early. And then you look at Celest, and they sort of dip pretty hard here. Don't worry about the coupler bit there. And this sort of rolls off a little earlier and a little harder than a set like Alina. So it's kind of hard to look at the graph in isolation, but when you look at it against other sets, I think it makes a little more sense when you try to picture what it sounds like. And it actually does sort of resemble these two, which also coincidentally kind of resemble hybrid versions of more of a blonde sound, where the sound is sort of anchored in this lower bit and really nice low end, deeper vocals with more body, very non-fatiguing rise, and then you sort of have a very relaxed treble style, and that's pretty much what Celest sounds like. So my first impression out of the box, I would say it was kind of safe and likable, very relaxed hybrid sound like I was just talking about. The miss on that is sort of the counter to it. It sounds like a decent hybrid. It sort of sounds like a Robin or other set that's around the same price, or even a dynamic driver. It doesn't quite sound similar to the full range planars and technicalities, bass, treble, all that is just a little different. And it's not that surprising because it is a hybrid, and I'm not sure how they divided up the actual frequency range, but clearly there's a part that the planar handles and there's a part that the balanced armature handles. And the balanced armature part, isn't that much of a surprise. It sounds like a balanced armature, and therefore you get this sort of hybrid-like sound. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. It's just you wouldn't necessarily want to compare this to Timeless, or it probably competes with some sets that you already have, which is sort of the other problem about this one is they're sort of touting the square planar driver, but when you really listen to it, it kind of puts you right back into, typical hybrid sound. So it doesn't really have those technicalities that the full range planars do. So it probably is going to be, in the ballpark of something that you already have if you already have a few hybrids or dynamic drivers. And I'm just not sure this was the best showcase for this driver. It's really hard to figure out what the driver can do on its own, what the balanced armature is doing. Is this really the optimal tuning for either one of those? And none of that was really clear to me. Certainly it's likable, but as far as having standout capabilities in any one area, I kind of fell back on it's likable, and I couldn't really go too much farther than that. Second impression of it, the stage definitely needs to be bigger. It's very much in your head. Even at this price range, I think lots of $20 sets do a much better stage than Celest does at the moment. So who should buy it? And does it add something to your dynamic driver set that you might have or your budget hybrid? And that's sort of the question that I really couldn't answer. I just couldn't figure out at what point does the square planar driver add something to the set that does something different than what other sets at $49 do, at $20 do, or $69 do. It's really hard to put my finger on the bit that makes this one different and stands out, and I couldn't quite figure it out. So yeah, I sort of fell back on this. I'm just not sure this was the right showcase. Maybe it is, and I'm just missing it, but there isn't really, I couldn't find a very compelling reason why you would really want this one over a single dynamic driver or a budget hybrid. What is that bit that pushes it over the top that a single dynamic driver can't do on its own? So sound-wise, like I talked about, it's almost the opposite of most planars, which are brighter, more analytical, technical. This one is more warm and thicker, mid-bassier sound, and it leans a little bit dark because it rolls off a little bit early. And I would just call it blondish. It's sort of a cleaned up blonde, which is how I would describe those other sets as well. Definitely not as much mid-bass as the blonde does, but the curves are very similar. That relaxed, thicker, more natural, no fatigue. Lots and lots of blonde adjectives can also be applied to Celest as well. But, pretty much the opposite of a lot of the planars that you're typically used to hearing about. So the bass is quite okay. It's definitely thicker than I was a little expecting, and whether they call it a planar, but it sounds like a dynamic driver, it sounds a little thicker like a dynamic driver to me. But it definitely anchors the sound. Like I said, it's kind of like that blonde. The center of gravity is just shifted just a little bit towards the mid bass. It's got this heavier sound to it, and that tends to be very likable. This one has a very likable bass level. It's not too much. It's just a little bit extra, kind of like a cleaned up blonde would be, and it just hangs around a little bit longer. And that's why I said it doesn't quite decay out like a planar does, like you're typically the Gang of 8 planars. It just hangs around a little bit longer. And those sharper attacks, especially on the drums, it's going to be a little bit harder to find because of that dip at about 5K and the roll-off in the upper treble. So if you're looking for those drum hits to be a little harder and then have this nice deep follow-on, you kind of get the deep, but not the initial attack. It's kind of an interesting sound. Mids, it definitely sounds more like a hybrid. Definitely not as much clarity as you get on some of the planars that we've talked about before. Generally, it's just a relaxed listen, just enough detail to sound like a hybrid. I tend to prefer hybrids. I like hybrids because they add a little bit to a dynamic driver. This one kind of just about gets there. On complex track, again, I talk about this recipe for success. You got to line up your bass, the stage, this slightly dark upper treble. All these things help out your mids. You have to set up everything around the mids to make the mids sound better. And this one, they tend to conspire against the mids, and just the bass hanging around a little bit longer, the stage not being as big as it should be, and that slightly dark treble, that dip at 5K, they sort of conspire against the amount of detail that you get and the clarity and the separation, the imaging and the layering, especially on more complex tracks. On simpler tracks, it's actually not too bad. It kind of sounds like a pretty decent hybrid. The upper mid pin gain, quite good. I like that level. Not pushed at all. Again, it has that blonde easiness to it, that relaxedness to it. Not super energetic female vocals, but they definitely sound reasonable, but they just don't have the dynamics that you would get on something like a full range planar. Treble, again, relaxed. I'm sure they did it just because of coherence with mixing the planar and the balanced armature. They sort of constrained and controlled the treble a little bit, and it definitely sounds more coherent, but that gives you less dynamic range, and you're really missing the top end of most of those instruments. And again, it kind of goes back to this dip. This dip is actually pretty hard, and most sets where you get dynamic drivers that are trying to sound like very dynamic hybrid sets, they tend to carry across about 2 to 5K at a pretty reasonable level, just like that, just the way Alina does. We can take a look at that real quick. You know, this is actually pretty typical, right? So about 2 something to 5K, then you dip a little bit as you're going into some of the harder hitting instruments, some of the things that are going to cause a little bit more fatigue, so you dip down a little bit, and then you carry over extension. And the way they did it on Celeste, where it dips really hard about here, that's probably just a little bit early and probably dropping a little bit more. I'm not sure, but as I said, it's not that uncommon to have that signature, and then to have this drop off a little bit early. Again, your air, all those upper treble things that would probably expand the stage a little bit, give you a little more air and sparkle. Not quite there on this one because it rolls off a little bit early, but on the other hand, you don't get any real sibilance or fatigue or that planar sheen that you would get on the full range planar. So there's definitely a benefit to a more relaxed treble like this one. So stage, like I said, it's kind of okay with, but there's really no height. It really needs to be, it probably needs just, as I said, a little more treble in the upper range to make the stage sound a little bit bigger, and it's just kind of mostly centered in your head. And when you take it, as I said, together with the other things that are going on around the mids, you know, it just doesn't add two really, really nice sounding mids. It's sort of a negative multiplier in this case. And if they had fixed that, it probably would have made the mid sound a little bit more open, a little more detailed, a little less cluttered, and, you know, maybe a little better sounding set. But we'll see. This is only their first set with this new driver, so I'm sure there will be others to follow on. But for now, that's what I got on Celeste. So thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.